was raining a little bit, but it looks like it stopped, which is nice. And what did I read today? Just trying to follow up on that story with that drone attack and whether or not the US is going to respond to it. How about this one? This one says, Biden says he has decided US responds to Jordan attack. So what exactly is going to happen? It says, Mr. Biden did not elaborate in his remarks at the White House, but added, I don't think we need a wider war in the Middle East. An Iran-backed militia group has claimed responsibility for the attack at a US military base. Dozens more were injured on Sunday's strike near the Syrian border. The overnight drone attack was the first time US soldiers were killed by enemy fire in the Middle East since the Israel-Gaza war erupted on the 7th of October. Asked by reporters on Tuesday morning if he had decided how to respond to the attack, Mr. Biden said yes. He was also asked if Iran should be blamed, saying, quote, I do hold them, Iran, responsible in the sense that they're supplying the weapons to the people who did it, he said. Iran has denied any involvement in the attack. National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby said the US might take a tiered approach in its response. So what does that mean, huh? It says not just a single action, but potentially multiple actions over a period of time. He told reporters on board Air Force One Mr. Biden's trip to attend election fundraisers in Florida. The guiding principle is making sure that we continue to degrade the kinds of capabilities that these groups have at their disposal to use against our troops and our facilities, he said. Mr. Kirby added, the president will do what he has to do to protect our troops and our facilities and to look after our national security. That's kind of really broad, and at the same time, it makes me think too, doing something over a period of time, aren't they already in conflict and they're already doing that? And it almost makes it sound like this just gives more reason to, I guess, continue the conflict, if that makes sense. But who knows? Is this gonna bring out an all-out war and all that? Because it seems like either side, they have the excuse per se to attack each other, which is a little unfortunate. Usually more examples too in these stories, I guess in contrast, it's these military drones and stuff that you should be worried about in my opinion. But in regards to things like a recreational drone, this was kind of interesting as in recent times, DJI updated its firmware, and you would assume, for example, it's to fix bugs, give you new features usually when companies do this. But it's kind of an interesting detail here where, you know, in places like the US, they're pushing for things like remote ID. And when it comes to the recent Mini series, you could actually buy different batteries, ones that have larger capacity, but because of that, it brings the drone over the 249 gram threshold, which technically means you have to register it, for example, and it has to abide by drones that are over that weight. And with this firmware, apparently it can tell the FAA that you're using the heavier battery, which is kind of interesting. Like this one says, new DJI firmware can tell FAA if you're flying your mini drone over weight limit. And they discuss about the battery options, for example, the Intelligent Flight Battery Plus, which makes it from 30 minutes to 45 minutes, but it makes it go overweight. And it says until recently, a lot of DJI Mini 3 operators had been upgrading their batteries, but let's say forgetting to change their settings to reflect the change in drone weight on their remote ID. Remote ID is a system required by the FAA for drones to share basic details about themselves via radio frequencies so that nearby aircraft can identify the drone and take any action they need. The FAA sets the remote ID standards. Remote ID is also used for enforcement agents who can scan drones and learn their specifications remotely using the system. So they mentioned here with the older firmware in the DJI Mini 3 and the drone required the operator to use the software DJI Fly to tell the remote ID system whether the heavier Intelligent Flight Battery Plus was being used. As such, the drone weighed over 250 grams, and it says UK users weren't able to experience this issue as the extended battery wasn't sold in the market. It says there were a lot of new before you fly compliance tips in the latest update of DJI Fly, some of which make it easier to operate in previously controlled airspace, but this one will automatically prevent inadvertently breaking rules. So again, usually when they update firmwares, you would assume it's just new features, but it's kind of interesting with this a little bit. And I wouldn't doubt, for example, people didn't quote forget in terms of registering the weight when they put the extra battery, but it's kind of interesting where, again, when it comes to flying things like drones, it seems like there's less privacy, I guess you could say, and more ways that companies or organizations are actually broadcasting your information, which is kind of interesting to think about with the story of that drone that attacked the US. It makes you wonder why they aren't doing that for their equipment to identify, hey, this is our drone versus, let's say, the enemy, because one of the assumptions is they just mixed it up like we didn't know whose drone it was. And this was kind of fascinating. Apparently there was this situation where somebody made a complaint to Air Canada in an official way, and because he did that, I guess Air Canada is actually suing them, which is kind of fascinating to think about. It says here, Air Canada takes BC couple to court over flight delay complaint. Earlier this month, while on vacation in Greece, Andrew and Anna Diskowski learned that Air Canada was taking them to court. Nearly 4 years earlier, the BC couple had filed a complaint with the Canadian Transportation Agency, the quasi-judicial tribunal and regulator that has jurisdiction over various aspects of the transportation system in Canada. The complaint was centered around a January 2020 flight that the couple says was delayed for 24 hours. Nearly 4 years later, the CTA ruled that Air Canada owed the Tukowskis $1,000 each and gave the airline until the end of December to pay. Instead, Air Canada has opted to challenge the ruling in federal court. If the airline is successful, the couple fears they could be out for more than just the $2,000 compensation they received. They could also be on the hook for Air Canada's legal costs. Can you believe that? This would make me think kind of that thing like last year, remember? Where there was that phone company giving my mom grief and all that, and I did it through all the official ways. Everything documented. Can you imagine that afterwards, where I did it through that way, and then the company says, oh, we're gonna take you to court because we don't agree, for example, with the fees that we have to pay you afterwards. So how would you explain this? Because it says the legal fallout is a result of changes the federal government made to the Canadian Transportation Act last year. The amendments were intended to clarify, simplify, and strengthen consumer protection for air passengers. They also gave new powers to the CTA to help clear a backlog of more than 45,000 complaints. Tukowski's case is raising concerns that the new rules may disproportionately favor airlines which can afford to engage in lengthy court proceedings and place financial risk on passengers. Is this how it always worked? It said previously passengers and airlines dissatisfied with the CTA decisions could apply to the Federal Court of Appeal, which offered a more limited scope for review. The process acted as a filter against meritless appeals, as the CTA's factual findings were binding and generally not open to further appeal. Lukex says that is no longer the case following the amendment, saying, quote, because the Liberals in their infinite wisdom decided that those decisions by the CTA officers are no longer deemed by the law to be decisions by the agency, all these protections that were in place to prevent flooding the courts with airline challenges are gone. Well, it's kind of fascinating, I guess. What would you think of this case? That doesn't seem right to me anyways. If, again, Air Canada was in the wrong, they were found to be, I guess, responsible, supposed to give them compensation, but just using this as a way to intimidate people potentially, knowing most people would just bow out because you can't afford it, time and resources to fight large corporations. That's kind of crazy. All right, see you guys later.